personally curious about and would like to know more, please feel free to ask me questions as we go throughout the tour today. Now, I do keep kind of an ongoing monologue going throughout the tour, so if you do have a question, feel free to just speak up. All right, now, as you can imagine, this is not an old historic roundhouse that was left by another railroad that used to service this area. This is very much a new facility that our founder had constructed to house his private collection of historic railroading equipment. Construction of this place began in 2008, and the roundhouse proper that we're standing in right now was done by 2010. The visitor center we just came out of, as well as the storehouse, the large brick building across the complex from us there, those came a few years after that. So, when Mr. Jacobson was having this place constructed, he wanted it to be made out of as many local resources as he could get his hands on. For instance, every brick that you'll see here on the property was made by Belden Brick here in Sugar Creek, Ohio. And we also have 18 of these large, black, triangular-shaped, kind of funnel-looking structures. There's one over every stall track here inside the roundhouse. Those are called smoke jacks. Those function very similar to a chimney in a house that carries all of the smoke from the fireplace out through the chimney to keep the exhaust gases from the fire from exiting into the home itself. Same application here, except our fireplaces have wheels and tend to roll around from time to time. So those allow us to fire up a steam locomotive on any stall track here inside of the building. And all the smoke will go up that chute and out through the roof. If those were not installed in this place and we had even one of these machines fired up, the building would fill up with smoke very quickly, and it would be very hard to breathe. And those smoke jacks were made out of steel by Dover Tank and Plate, not far from us in Dover, Ohio. Now, before we really start getting into the nitty-gritty of the collection here today, I've just got a few questions for you here today. By show of hands, how many of you have ever been here before? Okay, so we got a pretty new crowd here today. Sarah, you don't count, you work here. Now, those of you that aren't here today, how many of you already came here liking trains? Please be honest. That's more than we normally get. All right, now, out of you here, how many of you knows how a steam locomotive works? Okay, there we go. So, a teaching opportunity. Wonderful. So, to give you a basic understanding of how these machines operate, I'll use little number 14 here. This is the smallest steam locomotive that we have here in the collection, and as such, it gives us a good understanding of the basic anatomy that just about all of these machines share. And I'll start with the large cylindrical portion of the locomotive that you can see here. That is called the boiler. Inside of the boiler, there is water that's being heated to create the steam that the engine will use to move itself around. Now, in order to heat the water inside of the boiler, come on around here. At the back of the boiler is kind of a squared off portion. On most of our locomotives, it is designated by lighter gray, kind of graphite paint. On 14, it's a little harder to see because it is so small, but we can look inside of that area on this one only. So looking inside of here, we're looking inside the greater cab. This is where the crew sits inside of the engine to operate it, but more specifically, I'm going to show you this open porthole here in the center of the back of the engine. That is called the firebox. Inside of there is some kind of combustible fuel substance that the crew is burning to create heat inside of the engine. Typically, nowadays, we use coal or oil. Back in the old days, the 1800s, even into the early 1900s, they used wood. But this one in particular, from what we've been told and what clues we've been able to derive from this engine, we've come to the conclusion that this little one burned blow gas, pressurized blow gas, which was a byproduct of creating steel in blast furnaces around an environment where this little engine was typically operating in. So you've got your combustible substance burning inside of this empty chamber here, but if you look straight through there, what do you see? Anything?
Looks like a
Darkness?
chamber.
Huh?
Looks like a chamber of some sort. Several chambers.
Yeah, several chambers.
Like
Kind of
a
looks like a
hive.
beehive.
Yeah.
Yes. So if you look straight through there into the far side of the firebox, it kind of looks like a beehive. All those little holes are actually the beginnings of the boiler's tubes. They're long tubes that run throughout the length of the boiler and carry the heat from the fire, as well as the smoke and exhaust gases from the burning fuel throughout the boiler to heat the water inside. Now, coming around to this side of the engine, as the water inside of the boiler starts to boil, it starts creating steam. Steam naturally rises, and you want to collect that steam for use to move the engine around. So just about every steam locomotive has a raised portion of the boiler where the steam is allowed to connect or collect for the locomotive's use. And in the case of bowl number 14, it's this big, large dome on top of it right here just in front of the cab. And it's quite literally called the steam dome. Inside of there is a valve that the engineer operating the locomotive has control over via the throttle. It's a large metal lever inside of the cab. And as the engineer opens the throttle, they open the valve in the steam dome to allow the collected steam through piping, where it ultimately ends up down here in one of the steam locomotive's two cylinders. All of our steam locomotives have two, one on each side, and they're kind of similar to a cylinder in a car's engine in that there is a piston inside of here. Now, whereas a car's pistons are single acting on the drive shaft, a steam locomotive's pistons are dual acting. The steam is applied to the piston on both sides of it. So the steam is allowed into this cylindrical chamber on both sides of the piston, and as the steam expands, it puts pressure on the piston within, which is connected to these large heavy steel rods on the outside of the engine known as the driving rods. So the force of the steam expanding in the cylinder pushes the piston, which pushes the rods and makes the rods turn the wheels. So that's how the engine uses its steam to move itself around, and then the steam is exhausted through hollow chambers in this area here. It kind of looks like it's riding under the neck of the steam engine up there in the front. Now come on around here. That area there is called the steam chest, or the saddle. And if you look right into the front end of 14 here, it's one of the few engines that you can really get a look inside of the front end of. You can see a few different things. Come on over. So inside here, you can see the ends of the boiler tubes that come out into this empty space, what is known as the smoke box. That's where the exhausted steam and the smoke from the fire all mix together to be exhausted out of the smokestack on top. Now, in order to funnel all of that exhaust gas and steam up through the smokestack, that is where those hollow chambers in the steam chest come into play. They all empty out into this central nozzle right here in the bottom of the smoke box, this little blast nozzle. And the force of that steam shooting out of there and straight up through the stack creates a vacuum. That vacuum helps draw the exhaust gases and heat from the fire through the boiler more efficiently, and also forces the smoke out through the stack along with the exhausted steam. So typically this area is closed, like you'll see on most of our other engines here. You keep this door shut, and it is supposed to be kept airtight to make sure that that vacuum is working properly. But this is the only engine in our collection that we really can give you a full 360-degree view of because it is so small. It's been a wonderful teaching tool for us ever since arriving here to the museum back in about 2015. Not only is it the smallest engine we've got, it is also the oldest piece in our collection, dating back to 1897. It was built by the H.K. Porter Company for use in the steel industry. Come on over here. You'll see on the side, it is lettered up for its original home, Carnegie Steel's Duquesne Works, just outside of Pittsburgh. And that was where it spent its entire life, shuffling around a few cars of molten steel or slag around the steel complexes. Locomotive basically built to be small enough to fit in around the tight quarters of an industrial environment. So it really wasn't built to go out on the main line and haul fast passenger trains or heavy freights. It was built for a very specific purpose. And other than that, it wasn't good for much of anything else except for public display. After it was retired from the steel industry, it was put on static display at Station Square in Pittsburgh, PA, where it sat for quite a few years until the complex started expanding further. More shops and restaurants were put in and basically pushed this little engine out. It was then donated to a public display in a park near Sewickley, Pennsylvania, where it was stationed for kids to play on, as well as with an old wooden caboose that was gutted and used for kids' birthday parties. That was all well and good for a couple of decades while the engine and the caboose sat there, but Mother Nature is not kind to raw metal and wood. So over those 2 decades, the engine and its steel and wooden components started to rust and rot, and the city council was starting to get concerned about kids getting injured on the splintering wood and rusting metal. So the locomotive and the wooden caboose that was sat behind it were both put up for sale. Thankfully, we did place the highest bid for both of those pieces. There were some scrap dealers eyeing this little one with dollar signs in their eyes, looking to cut it up and melt it down. But we were able to preserve it here at the museum instead of it being lost to history. Now, kids, if you are good for your parents here on the tour today and stick with me throughout the whole thing, you will get a chance to ring the bell on top. Something to look forward to. Now then, come on down here. We'll go from our smallest engine to one of our much larger pieces. Now, like I said, 14 came to us from a park display. A number of our other locomotives have come to us from static park displays. But some of our other pieces have come to us from other railroad museums, not too terribly dissimilar from ourselves. 401 is a very good example of that. We acquired this locomotive from the Mid-Continent Railroad Museum up in North Freedom, Wisconsin. They had acquired this locomotive back in the days when steam engines were being scrapped left and right. That is really when you started seeing railroad museums popping up. They were trying to preserve these old machines as best as they could before they ended up disappearing forever. So the Mid-Continent Museum was able to acquire this one. They originally wanted to use it to power their museum excursion trains with it, but unfortunately for them, the Mid-Continent Museum has a collective 7 miles of trackage to work with, 3.5 miles one way. So after buying the locomotive and getting it to the museum complex and seeing it in person, they realized that this was a bit overkill for 3.5 miles one way. So it got added to their static outdoor display collection as the largest steam engine that the Mid-Continent had at the time, where it and the rest of their collection had to and still have to contend with the local river from time to time. There is a river that runs not far from the Mid-Continent's property that does tend to flood on occasion, and that led to 401 being later considered one of our submarine engines in our collection. It has sustained quite a bit of water damage, though not nearly as bad as one of our other engines that we'll see later on in the collection, but from what the shop staff has told me, the big cylinders on 401 are basically rusted shut. They're seized up. And it's going to take more than a typical can of WD-40 to get them unfrozen. So, the locomotive was put up for sale, not because the museum was tired of it or really sick of looking at it, but really because of a more modern concept in railroad preservation. So back in the early days when museums first started popping up and these things were being scrapped en masse, you basically were just trying to save whatever was available to you. That was good so that most of these pieces could be preserved in the long run, but a more common notion in railroad preservation is that a lot of museums are trying to more accurately represent the areas they serve. So the Mid-Continent Museum was trying to streamline their collection and make sure that it properly represents northern Wisconsin railroading. This locomotive, who operated for the Alabama, Tennessee, and Northern Railroad, a freight hauling line going from the port of Mobile Bay up in the northern parts of Alabama, doesn't exactly represent Wisconsin railroading very well. So that is why it was put up for sale. We were the only bidder on this one because the costs that would end up being accrued to move the engine from the museum to anywhere were going to be astronomical for any organization intending to do so, because the rail link from the museum to the nearest mainline railroad was at that time out of service. There was a bridge that was out of service. So in order to move this locomotive to the nearest rail point to be transported anywhere, what we ended up having to do was having it lifted up whole by 2 gigantic cranes onto a large 93.5 wheel truck trailer. trucking it 4 miles to the nearest rail point using those same 2 gigantic cranes to lift it up again and load it onto a railroad flat car, where it was brought down to Sugar Creek, Ohio by rail, lifted off again, and then set back on its own wheels here at the museum property. Now, the locomotive itself cost $10,000 at auction. Again, we were the only bidder on it, so we had free rein. After that, there's 10% extra for the auctioneer's fee, so we're up to $11,000. By the time it got here, and before we put any work into cosmetically restoring it, before it got all this nice black paint applied to it, we had dumped over $90,000 into it. So the cost of these things can really range very wildly, depending on how many people want them, but moving them from one place to the next can be very costly. Now, our founder, Mr. Jacobson, before actually constructing this place, he actually used to own and operate his own railroad, actually here in the area. How many of you here were once familiar with the Ohio Central Railroad and the excursions they used to run here? One. Well, one of these 3 next engines should look pretty familiar to you. For those of you that are not familiar, our founder, Jerry Jacobson, in the late 1980s started up what he called the Ohio Central Railroad System. Oh, and for any of you that are interested, the true star of the show has made his presence known to us today. Yes, thank you, Felix. Felix is our shop cat, as well as our mascot and owner of everything you see in front of you. It's not the museum foundation that owns this stuff, it's Felix. But anyway, so Mr. Jacobson started building up his own railroad, starting with an excursion operation here in the Sugar Creek area on the tracks that are just outside of our property here. That is a long stretch going from Brewster down to Zanesville, and he purchased that line to start his excursion operation, just running between downtown Sugar Creek down the line to Baltic and back. And that was what made the money for the Ohio Central for the first 3 years or so, while Mr. Jacobson built up the freight arm of the Ohio Central. Ultimately, the Ohio Central turned into a 550-mile-long railroad, really hauling freight for the most part, all across the eastern side of the state of Ohio, extending as far east as Pittsburgh. But what most people knew the Ohio Central for were the steam-powered excursion trains, as well as special runs that Mr. Jacobson liked to do with his steam locomotives. He loved steam engines from the time he was a kid, and was very passionate about them, and loved sharing his passion and his collection with the general public, as well as his friends and family. Now, starting with numbers 13, 1293, and 1551, just a little bit beyond us here, these were the 3 excursion sisters that regularly ran here in the Sugar Creek area. Starting with number 13, this was the second locomotive that our founder had acquired for the excursion operation, and ultimately was the strongest of the 3 engines. Number 13 was built as a freight hauling engine by American Locomotive Company in 1920, originally for a freight hauling line in West Virginia known as the Kelly's Creek and Northwestern. It was a very small, short line freight hauling railroad. And when the Kelly's Creek was done with this one, it was later purchased by the Buffalo Creek and Gauley Railroad, hauling coal through the mountains between Dundon and White in West Virginia. Number 13 is still lettered up for the BCNG. If you take a step back to look at the side of its tender, it still reads as such. And at any given time, this one was hauling up to 60 loaded cars full of coal through the mountains between Dundon and Whiting. So a particularly strong little engine. And with the Buffalo Creek and Gauley being one of the last steam-operated railroads here in the United States, their main 3 locomotives were available for preservation. 13 was acquired by a short line railroad up in the state of New York, if I'm not mistaken. Sibling number 14 went on to be displayed statically over in Gaithersburg, Maryland, where it still sits today. And its other sibling, number 4, nicknamed Old Slobberface, is currently sitting in pieces down at the Cass Scenic Railroad in West Virginia. 13 spent a lot of its retirement bouncing from one short-lived excursion line to the next. If any of you here are from or around the Logansport, Indiana area, they used to have their own excursion operation where once a year for their Iron Horse Festival, 13 would be brought out to head up their excursion trips. After all of that, though, the engine was basically set off to the side, derelict, waiting for another person to take it on. And our founder, Mr. Jacobson, purchased it for his Ohio Central, fixed it up, and put it back into service in 1993. Now, if you come on down here for a bit, I can show you one of the biggest clues that we have to show us what kind of jobs a steam engine was built for. And this is knowledge that you can take with you throughout our collection here today, as well as to any other railroad museum that has steam locomotives. So, come on down here. If you are looking at an engine that you know absolutely nothing about and you want to know what kind of job it was built for, either passenger service or freight service, look at the size of its driving wheels, the large wheels where the heavy steel rods are attached to. Number 13's driving wheels are about 56 inches in diameter. They come up just shy of my shoulder. In the grand scheme of things, they are considered very short. What short wheels do for a steam locomotive is it puts more of the engine's weight on those wheels and provides it with more torque and power. So engines with smaller driving wheels were typically put on freight trains, heavy freight trains. So those engines need to be a lot stronger. Now, on the flip side of that, because the driving wheels were so small, you don't go as far per each revolution of the wheel as you would if the wheels were much larger. So you aren't able to get a lot of speed out of a freight engine with very small wheels. And that's okay. Freight trains were not typically intended to run at incredibly high speeds, as opposed to passenger trains. 1293 over here has driving wheels 70 inches tall. This engine can hit 70 miles an hour very comfortably, and engines that were specifically built for passenger service typically had very, very tall wheels, ranging anywhere from 70 to 80 inches in diameter. Now, to gauge the top speed of a steam engine, one kind of rough equation that you can do is you can take the diameter of the engine's driving wheels and add 10% to that, and that is the supposed top speed of the machine. So considering number 1293, the driving wheels themselves are 70 inches tall, tack on 10%, so you're looking at about 77 miles per hour being a top speed for this one. That wasn't really set in stone, though. These machines are very hard to gauge their top speeds on because depending on how well the locomotive is designed and how good the crew operating it is, you can get these things just about as fast as you want them to. 1293 has hit 70 miles an hour very comfortably without breaking a sweat, and it could probably get up to 80 or even more with a good crew firing it and operating it. Now, number 13, on the other hand, with 56-inch diameter driving wheels, could potentially reach a speed of about 60 miles an hour. However, because of the way it is designed, this little engine has a tendency to do what we call nosing as it goes faster and faster. What nosing is the locomotive will literally start to wobble back and forth. The front end will start swaying as the engine goes faster and faster. And that is a problem if you're wanting to run the engine at incredibly high speeds, because it'll get to a point where the engine will just shake itself off the tracks. But again, 13 was not expected to go incredibly fast. We never really ran it very fast. Excursion trains, we typically ran about 15 to 25 miles an hour here in the area. So 13 was perfectly well suited for that, despite the flaws in its design. 1293, on the other hand, ultimately became our founder's go-to steam engine. It was the third one fixed up to full operational condition for the Ohio Central and spent quite a good deal of time traveling under Mr. Jacobson's ownership. It is still considered a relatively small steam engine because of its size and stature in the grand scheme of steam locomotive design, I should say. But because of that, it is good running leisurely excursion trains at slower speeds. You're not wasting too much of your steam in this one running at slower speeds, but it can head out onto the main line and run a lot faster so that you're not bogging down the freight operations timetables. It has traveled further south from us here in Sugar Creek, going down to Byesville, Ohio. If any of you are familiar with Byesville, they used to have their own little excursion operation running there. And that was a big coal mining area here in the state of Ohio. So around October and September, they would host a coal miners festival to celebrate their industrial heritage in that area. And to head up those trains, they wanted a steam engine. So 1293 headed south to Byesville to head up those excursion trips. And it's also been further north of us, up to the Cuyahoga Valley Scenic Railroad that runs between Independence and Akron, Ohio. If any of you have ridden that before, great. If you haven't, I highly recommend it. 1293 did that for a couple of fall seasons before ultimately being retired here inside of the Roundhouse and Museum. Mechanically speaking, it is still in very good condition. However, its boiler has run out of its federally mandated time. And I'll talk about that in a bit more detail when we look at this engine's sister, just a couple of stalls down from us here. Now, apart from being used for excursion operations and being a wonderful museum piece, 1293 has been featured in a couple of different multimedia ventures. Are any of you here today, and I know it's a little early for this, are any of you here today fans of scary movies? Oh my goodness. Okay, one person. All right, well, I'm sure the rest of you have at least heard of an actress by the name of Jamie Lee Curtis before. Okay, there we go. Her breakout role was in the film Halloween, one of the classic horror films of the 70s and 80s. Have any of you seen a film that she starred in the year after Halloween came out called Terror Train? Again, Sarah, you don't count. You're an employee. Terror Train was another horror film that Miss Curtis starred in, and not many people remember it, for good reason. I've seen the film myself. You can find it for free on YouTube if you are so inclined to watch it. I have seen it a couple times myself. Once to see 1293 in action. 1293 stars as the titular terror train in the film from the beginning credits up to about the end of the film. So if you want to see this engine in action, I would highly recommend the movie to watch at least once, just to say that you did and to see this thing in action. If I ever watch the movie again, it's really just to get a good laugh. It's not the greatest film by any stretch of the imagination. And when you, or if, I should say, you do decide to watch on YouTube, it does come with Hungarian subtitles if English is your second language. But anyway, so that's the story of this one's jaunt into cinematic history. Are any of you here today fans of the Doobie Brothers? Yeah, there we go. So one of their most well-known songs is Long Train Runnin', right? So for their 1993 Long Train Runnin' remix album that they released in the year 1993, they featured a photograph of 1293 on the front of the album's cover. We've not been able to find a copy of that album intact that we can display with this engine. I have a photograph of it on my phone. If you would like to see it after the tour, please let me know. But it is wonderful to see this thing being featured in not just a museum collection, but in music and movies. And you'll find that a lot with some of the steam engines that you find in museums and in excursion railroading. They've been used for a lot of other things, whether it's for photography, movies, even music videos like to use a functional steam engine from time to time. Now coming down here, number 1551 is the smallest of the three excursion siblings. It's also the oldest of the three, being built in 1912, as opposed to 13 being built in 1920. And 1293 actually is the youngest steam engine in our collection, being built in June of 1948. So, 1551, smallest and oldest, and the original Ohio Central Excursion Star. Starting in 1989, Mr. Jacobson's 1551 lettered up Ohio Central, headed up the excursion trips running between Sugar Creek and Baltic for 3 years by itself. And to me, that's pretty amazing to think about because, one, it did not suffer any major mechanical failures. Two, it is the oldest engine that was operated on Mr. Jacobson's Excursion Railroad. And three, all of the restoration work done to this one before starring on the Ohio Central Railroad, all of that was done by hand tools outside with a lot of volunteer hours. So getting an engine that old to operational condition with hand tools and it running for 3 straight seasons without any major issues is pretty amazing. Now, more specifically, this little engine was built in April of 1912. Can any of you here think of another event of historic significance that happened in 1912?
Titanic.
April. Thank you, yes. The Titanic sank in the Atlantic Ocean the same month and year. So, whereas we lost one piece of transportation technology in the Atlantic at that time, at least in regards to our collection, we got a fantastic piece of railroading history that was born that year. 1551 spent most of its time hustling commuters around the city of Montreal. It was very good for short passenger train service. It has enough get up and go to start a light passenger train at a moment's notice, and its driving wheels are not as tall as 1293s. They're about 67 inches tall as opposed to 1293-70, but that allows this locomotive to hit 60, 70, maybe even 75 miles an hour very comfortably if need be. Now, are any of you here familiar with the story of Casey Jones? Yeah, a few of you still yet. Oh, very good. So, Casey Jones was an engineer that was immortalized in poem and song, as well as an animated Disney short. Casey Jones was an engineer for the Illinois Central Railroad, and in the year 1900, he ended up being involved in a very nasty accident. Casey himself was known for operating his trains at excessively high speeds, and in 1900, he was trying to make up time on a run down to Vaughan, Mississippi on the Illinois Central, and the locomotive that he was operating was a locomotive just like number 1551 here. A steam locomotive with a wheel arrangement of 4 wheels in the front end, 6 large driving wheels behind the front pilot wheels, and no trailing wheels behind the drive wheels to support the weight of the cab and firebox. Locomotives of the 4-6-0 wheel arrangement were typically referred to as 10-wheelers, quite literally because they have only 10 wheels. You'll find that in the grand scheme of steam locomotive construction, larger classes and types were given some kind of nickname, and the nicknames derived from a number of different things. Either the number of wheels they had, the name of the railroad that first bought them, or the geographical areas that they were first tested in. And I'll go through some more examples of that as we go throughout the collection today. So Casey Jones was engineering a 10-wheeler locomotive just like 1551, and found himself coming around a curve, and in front of him was the rear end of a stalled freight train. He was made famous because he yelled at his firemen to jump out of the cab, and he stayed inside the cab of the locomotive, riding the brake and the whistle cord into the collision, and in doing so, he was able to slow his train down enough so that when the collision happened, all the passengers on board behind his engine were spared. Casey himself was the only casualty of that collision. So his firemen went to create the original Casey Jones poem, and that was later immortalized into song and animated features. But still, his name really hasn't carried on that well into history. As of right now, we do get a lot of younger generations, when you say the name Casey Jones, just kind of look at you like you've got bugs crawling out of your ears. But here at the museum, we're trying to preserve railroad history in many different forms, so that's why I bring it up. Now, right behind me here, I did say we had 1293's sister. This is her. Canadian Pacific number 1278, a locomotive just like 1293, same class, wheel arrangement, and design, built only 3 months prior to 1293's birth. Now, between the two locomotives here, they have spent quite a good deal of time in preservation, bouncing to different owners who have taken creative liberties with their outward appearances. So looking at the two of them, they are slightly different based on their outside appearances from each other, but the biggest difference is that 1293 is in much better shape. 1278 over here, not so much. And that is because one of 1278's previous owners was a small excursion operation over in Pennsylvania that wasn't quite sure how to properly take care of these old machines. One of our goals here at the museum is to pass on the trade skills necessary to properly maintain and operate these old steam locomotives, but a lot of that is done by word of mouth. A good amount of the paperwork and instructional materials that followed these locomotives around during the Age of Steam are long gone. When diesels took over and steam locomotives were no longer in common usage, a lot of that information was either thrown away or burned. It wasn't needed anymore, and people really weren't thinking about historic preservation. So if we can find any information on any of these machines, it's like striking gold. But apart from that, there are still older generation folks that used to operate and maintain these machines back in the day that are willing to help train younger generations to pass on their trade skills, which is something we try to do here, and the previous owner of this locomotive tried to do that. The owner of the Gettysburg Scenic Railroad over in Pennsylvania was one of those such gentlemen who was trying to impart his wisdom onto his younger crews. And have any of you played the telephone game? Yeah? By the end of the line, the message is a lot different. That's basically what was happening. Some of his teachings were either going misconstrued or forgotten about, one of which was the regular cleaning of safety equipment in the steam locomotive. Now, for our cars, we typically bring them in once every so often to get the oil changed and the tires rotated, and every now and then they need a bit more of a proper mechanical tune-up. Steam locomotives are incredibly complex mechanical machines, and just about every piece on a steam engine has to be removed and cleaned out and inspected from time to time. This one in particular has to be done once a month. Do any of you here know what this is today? Yes?
I forget the name of it, but it shows how much water it has.
Very good. So it's called a sight glass, or your water glass. This shows you how much water is inside of the steam locomotive's boiler at all times. If there's a fire lit inside of the engine's firebox, there has to be water showing inside of this clear little tube. You want it to be showing about 2/3, maybe 3/4 of the way full of water. If it's showing completely full of water, you're basically waterlogging your boiler and not providing enough space over top of the water for steam to form in the boiler. But if it's showing completely empty, you may or may not have mere seconds to jump out of the engine's cab before the boiler explodes. So, with 1278, the crew at Gettysburg was not cleaning this out regularly. If any of you have done any plumbing in your own homes with metal piping, you know that water is never 100% pure. There are microscopic solids that come with water that tend to build up inside of your piping. These little devices are no different. Every 30 days they have to be completely flushed out, so that way water is free to move in and out of this glass to show the crew how much water is inside of it. So, the sight glass of 1278 was partially plugged. It wasn't giving the crew a proper indication of how much water they had in this thing, or in this case, how much water they didn't have in it. I have this lovely little visual aid here today to help me out with this story. So, in June of 1995, the Gettysburg Scenic Railroad was running, my inner Elmer Fudd coming out. They were running one of their famous dinner trains. And the crew was operating the locomotive here in the cab. The firebox was burning nice and hot. And here in the diagram, you see the blue all around the firebox and the piping inside of the boiler. That is all water. Now, you want the firebox itself to be completely surrounded by water at all times. Where the sight glass comes into play is that the bottom of the glass itself is just about 3 inches or so off of the top layer of the firebox. So, if the glass is showing completely empty, there may or may not be some water left, but you need to get more water into your engine's boiler. So with the sight glass on 1278 being partially plugged up, they didn't know that the water level had fallen below the top layer of their firebox. Now, these things are made out of pretty much bulletproof steel. However, the fires that burn inside of them typically run upwards of about 1800 degrees Fahrenheit or more. that is well beyond the point of boiling water and will start to turn that steel into soft taffy. So the water level fell low, the fire was making this top layer, what is known as the crown sheet, nice and hot, and it started to get very soft. When they pumped cold water back into the engine's boiler, it hit the top layer of the firebox, and with it being as hot as it was, instead of just starting to boil into water, it flashed into steam instantly and created a huge, massive, rapid expansion of steam pressure inside of the boiler, popping the firebox out partially. This photograph shows the bulged out portion of 1278's firebox on the inside. That is where the built up steam pressure popped the roof of the firebox down and broke the large bolts that keep the firebox and boiler together. That's where these little Swiss cheese holes are. So with that, the steam inside of the engine's boiler was allowed to escape through the roof of the firebox and into the cab of the engine itself. Thankfully, 1278 did not completely blow up, which is usually the case for that, but instead, all of that hot steam shot back into the cab and seriously burned all three crewmen inside. They were all able to escape as the event took place. Both firemen jumped out of the engine's cab windows in order to get out of it, and you can see how high the windows are off of the ground. So apart from some nasty scrapes and bruises from hitting the ground at that height, they suffered second to third degree burns over about 30% of their bodies. The engineer stayed inside of the cab riding the brake to make sure that the train came to a full stop before getting out of the cab himself. In doing so, he developed second to third degree burns over about 90% of his body and was airlifted to the hospital. Thankfully, all three of them did survive and go on to live longer lives after the incident itself. The first one to pass away from that incident was the engineer, who died 10 years later from heart complications. Really not from anything involving this accident. So, that was one of the nastier accidents involving a steam boiler at that time, and really got the federal government thinking on how we can better take care of these things so that we don't end up with an engine completely blowing up. Are any of you here familiar with the steam traction engine that blew up at the Medina County Fairgrounds? No. That's all right. That involved a steam traction engine with a steam boiler much smaller than this one, but it completely exploded. It killed the operator running the engine, and flying shrapnel injured dozens of other people. That was one of the events that kind of got the ball rolling. This thing really cemented the fact that we need stricter rules to take care of steam boilers, especially steam locomotives running for public excursions or service. So the federal government came up with what we now know as the 15-year inspection, or the 1472-day inspection. What that requires places like us to do is, if we intend to run one of these for public service, every 15 years or 1,472 operating days, whichever comes first, we have to bring the locomotive in, completely strip it down to a bare boiler inside and out, and we have to ultrasound the boiler every 12 inches. You'll see an example of this when we get into the back shop. One of our engines is gridded up as such, and you'll see just how many little spaces have to be, ultrasounded. And you have to ultrasound each of those little spaces 3 times. You save all of that data on a disk, ship it off to the federal government, and they either give you the thumbs up or thumbs down. If they give you the thumbs up, you can put the engine back together again, do any mechanical repairs that need to be done to it, and run it for another 15 years. Great. I'm giving you a gross summarization of this process, by the way. The restoration of a steam locomotive is something that groups should not, and oftentimes do not, take on lightly. Depending on the size and condition of the locomotive, it can be incredibly costly to undertake. The skills needed to perform that kind of work are hard to find, frankly, here in the 21st century, and it can take a long time. We have a dedicated shop staff that works here year-round, and our engine that's currently in the back shop right now has been there for about 5 years at this point. If you're talking about a small volunteer organization that's running on donation funding, you can run anywhere from 1 decade to 3 or potentially 4, depending on the size of the engine and how much work needs to be done to it. To give us a good representation of that, we will consider numbers 1278 and 96 sitting behind me. Both of these locomotives are not in operational condition by any stretch of the imagination, but could potentially one day be restored to operational condition and run passenger trains for guests visiting the area like yourselves. Mr. Jacobson did initially purchase 96 to potentially restore it and run the Ohio Central excursion trains with it. Now, considering these two engines next to each other, number 1278 is the larger of the two locomotives. Both of these would still be perfectly well suited for excursion service, but 1278 is the bigger of the two. So you would think that the larger engine would be the more expensive one to restore. And that would be the case if it weren't for the fact that 1278 at least has pretty much all of its major components still intact. They may not all be installed on the engine presently, but we do have them here at the museum. 96, on the other hand, is missing a lot of pieces. When you are restoring a steam locomotive, there are a number of different avenues that you can take. The most commonly taken avenue is that when a piece on engine breaks and has to be completely replaced, you go to another engine that you're not currently doing anything with, and you take that piece off of it and put it back on the one that you want to keep in operational condition. That is the least expensive way of doing that, but does kind of strip down other steam engines until they're just about nothing. 96 was a victim of this cannibalization from one of its previous owners, who had 3 steam locomotives just like this one. They were all siblings of each other. And that gentleman, a guy by the name of F. Nelson Blount, if any of you are familiar with the Steamtown National Historic Site in Scranton, Pennsylvania, he was the one that started that. He was operating this one's sibling, number 89. And in order to keep 89 in operation, he would occasionally take pieces and parts off of little 96 here to supplement that engine. So, 96 is missing a lot of components. On top of that, some of the pieces that are still left on it will need to be replaced. They have deteriorated to the point where they are unsavable. If you look at the cowcatcher or front pilot of this one, you can see where some of the piping slats are completely broken and will need to be replaced. And then looking at the face of the engine, there is a large crack here in the smoke box front that may be able to be patched up, and the locomotive could still potentially run with that. But looking at the door of the smoke box, there is a very hastily welded, jagged crack running along the bottom edge of it. Kind of looks like a really crooked smile. That is unsavable. So this entire circular door will need to be recast as a solid piece. And going further up from that, literally on top of the engine, is its tall smokestack. It's about 3 feet tall. And if you look at the base of it, particularly on this side, there is a hastily welded patch on it, as well as large cracks around the bolted areas that help keep the smokestack onto the top of the engine's smoke box. That piece will need to be recast as well. Now, it is not impossible to recreate old steam locomotive pieces. That is actually something that we are able to facilitate here at Age of Steam. And this is a good example right here. So, with old broken pieces, what we can do is use them to create forms and patterns to ship off to a steel foundry to pour the molten metal to create those new pieces for us. This smokestack right here, with the big hole rusted through it, used to sit atop our big express engine number 6325's, whose face you can just see peeking out behind number 14. That one was restored by our founder and his Ohio Central Railroad, and in doing so, the smokestack needed to be replaced. So we created this wooden form off of the original piece's shape and sent it off to a steel foundry. They poured us a brand new stack, and it was installed on top of the engine where it still sits today. But we are very fortunate in that we have the ability to do so. Our founder did gain a lot of money both in the stock market and operating his railroad, And even now here as the museum, Jerry and his wife Laura set up a wonderful endowment for the museum so that we can continue functioning into the future. Our base level income is the interest from that endowment that allows us to keep the lights on and the doors open, but the money gained from tour revenue, equipment leasing or sale, that helps us do all of the fun stuff, the big restoration projects, the acquiring of new equipment and other pieces for the collection. So your visiting us here today is still a wonderful benefit to the organization, even though we do have that nice little safety blanket sitting underneath of us. That helped us a lot going through COVID. All right. Now, thankfully, not all of our steam locomotives are in such bad condition as 96. Some of them arrived in good enough shape to be fired. Number 9 is a good example of that. This engine is in good operational condition. It's just that its boiler is past that 15-year time period, so we can't fire it up for the public as of yet. This little engine we acquired back in 2015 from its previous owner, an excursion operation up in Wisconsin known as the Kettle Moraine. Now, the owner of the Kettle Moraine, unfortunately, after they were forced to shut down their excursion operation in 2001, they had enough foresight to store this locomotive indoors under a roof where Mother Nature was not able to start working on degrading the steel of the locomotive or its old historic wooden pieces. Looking at the front of the engine here, all of the slats of its cowcatcher here on the front are made of wood. They are painted black, just like the rest of it, but they are wood, as well as the cab of the engine. That cab is almost entirely made out of wood. That is very rare to find on steam engines in the preservation era, because if this was left outside for as long as it was before Mr. Jacobson acquired it for the collection, those wooden pieces would have started rotting very quickly and could have potentially rotted to the point where they were unsavable. So thankfully, the Kettle Moraine put this thing indoors, kept it nice and dry, all the wooden pieces were saved, and 14 years later, when it was acquired for our collection, it was still in good enough shape to be fired up and operated. It has been fired up at least once here on the property as a test run to see what kind of condition it's in. And with that being said, it is the oldest fireable engine in our collection. Number 14 is the oldest by build year in 1897. This one is not far off of it. This one was built by the Baldwin Locomotive Works in 1901, right at the turn of the last century. This locomotive is over 120 years old and can still be fired up and operated. When it was originally constructed, it was built for logging service. This is a good picture of this little one in logging service in Northern California. And there are a couple of details in this picture that you don't see in front of you right now. Can anyone point out at least one of the details in this picture that are different from today? I'll give you a clue. Yes? Wood. Yes, very good. The locomotive, inside of its tender, the car that rides behind it to hold its fuel and water, has a large lumber pile. That is not inside the tender of this one anymore. It was converted from a wood-fired engine to oil. Yes?
It has a different funnel.
Very good. The smokestack is different. Looking at this picture, there is a big diamond stack or balloon stack on the engine's top. That was because the engine was originally built to burn wood. And you typically see those on the engines that are featured in Western films. So, when engines were originally being constructed here in the United States in the late 1800s, wood was more plentiful. So, wood was being used to fire those steam engines, but with all the hot, abrasive embers that are shot out of a wood-fired engine stack, those could potentially catch a lot of things near the track on fire. So those big diamond stacks were built with a number of layers of steel mesh inside of them to help catch those embers before they were ejected out into the air. So with the engine originally being built to burn wood, it had a lovely little diamond stack on it. It was later configured to burn oil about 19 years after its construction in 1920. And when that was done, the diamond stack was removed and replaced with the slender one that you see on top of it now, because the diamond stack was no longer needed. And this little engine does still burn oil to this day, one of the few in our collection that does so. Just about all of our other engines here in the collection burn some grade of coal. Now, Baldwin Locomotive Works, like I said, built this little one in 1901. 15 years later, the same company built this monstrous engine sitting right behind me. This shows you not only steam locomotive evolution and how quickly it went, but also these two give us a good understanding of steam engines being built for very specific purposes. Kind of similar to cars, you have cars that do various different things. You have a two-door sedan that's good for you and your wife or your husband just traveling around on a Sunday afternoon. You wouldn't hook up an 18-wheel trailer to a two-door sedan, would you? So, these are good examples of steam engines built for specific purposes, just like vehicles. Number 9 was built for logging service. Logging operations laid and pulled up their track very frequently. Because of that, it was made out of lightweight rail that was easy to tear up and lay down at a moment's notice. And because of the terrain that logging operations typically operated on, the tracks were oftentimes very rickety. So, in order to run over that kind of lightweight, rickety track, you needed small engines that sat very low to the ground, low center of gravity, made them very stable, and light in weight. Number 9 here weighs approximately 49 tons, not counting the engine's tender, which is still very light for a steam locomotive, so it was very good for that operation. If you tried to run number 33 on that kind of light temporary track, it would rip the rails up and topple right over. That being said, on the flip side of that coin, number 9 would not have been able to haul the heavy trains that this thing was built to carry. 33 was built specifically for hauling taconite, or iron ore. We do have a canister full of taconite pellets here. If you want to pass that around. This little canister here weighs about 5 pounds. And if you can imagine a whole hopper cars loaded with that stuff, you're talking about trains weighing multiple thousands of tons. So you needed big, strong steam engines to move those heavy ore trains. Now, the only problem with that notion was that typically if you wanted a stronger engine, you just built a bigger machine. That was all well and good for larger mainline railroads. This one was built for a smaller, short-line regional ore hauling line, the Munising and Marquette Railroad up in the northern peninsula of Michigan. So because of the tighter clearances that came with a short-line railroad, shorter turntables, smaller facilities, Baldwin had to build them as big of an engine as they could on as small of a frame as possible. So looking at number 33 from the front, it is very large and imposing. Thank you. It's actually the tallest steam locomotive in our collection. But if you come around to the side and look at it going from front to back, she is very stubby. This engine is basically a gigantic steam boiler on a very short frame with 8 short, stocky driving wheels led by tiny pilot wheels up in the front. So, with all of that weight on those tiny wheels, you remember my description of speed versus power? 33 has a lot of power to put out. It is actually the second strongest steam locomotive in our collection. And when considering its weight next to number 9, which I told you was approximately 49 tons, this is 140 tons of locomotive, and that's not even counting its tender. Counting both of the two of them together, you're looking at something more akin to 200 to 220 tons of steam locomotive on a very short frame. Very good for hauling heavy ore trains, definitely not built to go very fast. Now then, I've shown you one submarine in our collection with number 401 that sat just behind roll number 14. This is the worst example of a submarine in our collection. This is Baltimore and Ohio number 390. Good Lord. So 390 here is probably the worst looking engine that you will see here in our collection. And there's a very good reason for that.
After number 390 was retired from regular service, it was set on public display in a park in New Martinsville, West Virginia, right next to the Ohio River. And unfortunately, the Ohio River does like to flood in the spring when the winter snows start melting. And from what we've been told, there are photographs in our archives of this little one that were taken when the floodwaters were so high that all you could see of it sticking up out of the water was just the smokestack and the two domes on top of the engine. So it's been completely submerged. We can only guess how many times. And even after it was withdrawn from that park display, it was put on display in a railroad museum up here in Ohio, the Mad River and NKP Museum up in Bellevue. While it was there at that museum, they were not really able to do much for the engine to halt its deterioration. All of their collection is still sitting outside, but the museum has come a long way from the mid-1990s when this engine was displayed there. So the museum has done a lot to preserve their collection, even though it still sits outdoors, but that was long after this engine was gone. While it sat there up in Bellevue, rain, wind, and snow still battered away at this little one and rusted it away until this is all that we are left with. The steel cab of this locomotive deteriorated to the point where it had to be removed. It was junk at that point. So really, I don't foresee us restoring this little engine to full operational condition, but we could potentially cosmetically restore it on the outside and make it look a bit more like its old self. This is a photograph of this little engine in operation for the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad as a steam switcher locomotive. A switcher locomotive was one of these small engines that you typically saw around a railroad yard or an industrial yard, shuffling around short trains of cars or coupling short stretches of them up together to make longer trains for the bigger engines to take away. So not truly remarkable machines. However, this one is the only remaining steam switcher from the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. So it is historically significant in that regard, despite its outward appearance. Now, a good example of a cosmetic restoration is standing right behind me. 2630 is the only engine in our collection that is not just painted black, and very appropriately so. This one is painted army green. It is the only army engine in our collection, one of over 2,100 constructed during World War II, the vast majority of whom were shipped overseas to aid the Allied forces in Europe and places beyond. This one, however, stayed stateside at Fort Eustis in Virginia. This engine was used as a training engine. Soldiers would be brought into Fort Eustis, and this little engine would be used to show them how to maintain and operate these machines, so that when they were shipped out and met the countless hundreds of others of this one's siblings overseas, they would know how to maintain them and operate them. Now, this engine has been cosmetically restored here at the Age of Steam Roundhouse Museum. It came here back in 2015. After being retired from Fort Eustis, it was acquired by the Scenic Railroad down in West Virginia, who had hopes of operating the locomotive on a level stretch of track that ran along the Greenbrier River between Cass and Durban. If any of you are familiar with the Scenic Railroad, they specialize in locomotives that you will not see here today. Geared steam locomotives. Locomotives that do not have driving rods on the sides of the wheels. They are geared engines that use a drive shaft to turn the wheels so that the engines can climb steep grades and run over rough, rugged, logging trackage. Cass was a big logging town back in the day. So the majority of their rail line goes up into the West Virginian mountains. If you find yourself down there, I highly recommend it. But they had one more level stretch running between Cass and Durban that they wanted to run a more traditional, what is considered a rod locomotive, like all the ones that we have here. Unfortunately, back in the 1980s, a flood washed out part of that line and made it unusable. They have since restored that line and are hoping to make use of it in the near future, but at that point, 2630 was no longer part of their collection and was up here at Age of Steam. Unfortunately, Cass does not have a large engine house or roundhouse like we have here today. So a lot of their equipment does sit outside. They do their damnedest to take good care of it because it does sit outside where rain, wind, and snow is able to batter at it year round. But unfortunately, this one sat outside for quite a few years until this was the condition it was in when we got it. Quite a far cry from what you see in front of you here today. Now, this is the exact same condition it was in the year that we decided to do our first military show. And we are going to do that same show here coming up in the second week of September. We call it Steam to Victory. It's a World War II show that celebrates the impact that North American railroads had on the Allied victory overseas. And as such, we wanted our military equipment to be in fantastic shape for that. With this being our only Army engine in the collection, we wanted it to look a little nicer than this. So starting in January of 2019, this engine went into our back shop, and with us intending to do our first Steam to Victory show in July of that year, around the 4th, our shop staff only had about 7 months to get this thing in and out. The locomotive was done in mid-June and looked pretty much like it does today. Some minor work has been done since that point, but this is pretty much how it looked coming out of the shop in mid-June of 2019, all set and ready to go for our military show. Our shop staff does a fantastic job on our equipment here. So this is a good example of what our shop staff could potentially do with number 390 over there, but it's really sitting at the bottom rung of our to-do list right now. So it's going to be quite a bit of time before that locomotive enters the back shop. Now coming further down here, yes?
When they set this engine or one like it overseas, didn't he have to have it narrow track?
No. No. Over in Europe, it was still standard gauge track. However, to your point, the locomotives themselves had to be built smaller. So looking at this one between it and number 33, they are locomotives of the same type, a 280 wheel arrangement known as a consolidation type. This locomotive is only about 8 feet wide by about 12 feet tall. 33 is 10.5 feet by 16 feet. Railroad clearances here in the United States were wider and taller than they are over in Europe. So even though these locomotives were built to run on standard gauge track, just like here in the United States, 4 foot 8.5 inches from rail to rail on the inside, they still had to be built smaller in stature to fit the clearances available over in Europe with their turntables, depots, tunnels, and other infrastructure. All right, now coming on down here, we're going to look at the oddballs of our collection. Numbers 1 and 2 are, I hate to say it, but both of these locomotives will never run under their own power again. And it's not because we can't fix them, it's just that we can't charge either of them. Number 1 over here is one of the more unique engines in our collection, and we still refer to it as a steam engine, but it doesn't actually run on steam. This little one actually runs on compressed air. What you do is you hook this thing up to a large stationary air compressor and charge all 3 of these very thick steel tanks with air at about 800 plus psi, and the locomotive uses that to put pressure on the piston inside of its cylinder to make the rods turn the wheels. The reasoning for this kind of setup is so that the locomotive can operate safely around very volatile industrial environments. Ours in particular operated on a sugarcane plantation down in Cuba, but you also commonly saw these things around munitions plants, textile mills, power plants, and even down in mine shafts. These things were safe to operate because they were 100% fireless. These things don't burn anything to create the gas that allows them to move themselves around. So very safe to operate in those volatile environments. Their only issue with the compressed air engines in particular was that they could only run so far before having to be recharged again. In the case of these little compressed air engines, they had a very short range. Now, here in the 21st century, in our cars, a typical tank of gas will carry us anywhere between 350 to 400 miles, right? Out of this thing, and one charge of air, you only get 7 miles out of it before it has to be recharged. So that made these things quite susceptible to being replaced by newer, more efficient technology, like number 2. Number 2 is a fireless locomotive, just like number 1, except this one does operate on steam. Just like the compressed air engine, you still charge this thing up from a stationary source, but in this case we're talking about a large stationary boiler. You hook this thing up to a boiler and fill it about 4/5 of the way full with superheated water over 400 degrees, and the rest of the space inside of the locomotive will be taken up by steam. Now, what you're looking at is not a traditional locomotive boiler. You're looking at sheet metal covering about 6 inches of thermal insulation wrapping around a large cylindrical pressure vessel. So with all that thermal insulation wrapped around the water tank inside, the water within will maintain its hot temperature and will continue boiling to create steam for the engine to use as it uses more of its steam up. And with this configuration and this design, these locomotives could run for about 6 to 8 hours without needing to be recharged. That is a full shift of work. So these, what were known as fireless cooker steam locomotives, more or less replaced the compressed air engines. The vast majority of compressed air locomotives were scrapped during World War II for war materials. There are a lot of these fireless steam locomotives left in preservation for static display. We have this one here. There's another one over in Denison, Ohio, not too terribly far from us. But because these were so good at what they did, to this day, they're very rare, and you can't find them here in the States, but in secluded corners of the globe, you can still find some of these fireless steam locomotives operating around industrial environments. They're very rare, but they're still out there. All right. Now, in the interest of time, we're going to go down this aisle here, and we're going to go right to our Navy engine. So, coming on down here, and the kids might get a pick out of this one. This is our other military steam locomotive, taking the form of U.S. Navy number 4. This locomotive spent all of its life shuffling freight cars along the docks on the east side of Brooklyn, shuffling them on and off of naval ships, originally being owned by the U.S. Navy and later being adopted by the Brooklyn Eastern District Terminal. So this one was preserved and spent a lot of time in static display over at the Museum of Pennsylvania across from Strasbourg Railroad over in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. And thankfully, this is not the only Navy tank engine that has made it into preservation. One of this one's siblings is preserved over at the Strasbourg Railroad in Pennsylvania, and they do occasionally fire it up for their excursion trains. Now, if you go to the Strasbourg Railroad looking for a black Navy engine like we have here with white lettering and red windowsills, you can search your entire life and still come up empty-handed. What Strasbourg did with their Navy engine was not only restore it to operational condition, they also cosmetically altered its outside appearance. So instead of being black with white lettering, their Navy engine is now sky blue and has a big smiling face on the front end of it. Picture that in your mind right now. What is that?
Thomas the Tank Engine.
Yes, very good. Thomas the Tank Engine. So our Navy engine sibling is now the live steam Thomas that operates at the Strasbourg Railroad. I do not see our shop forces doing anything quite so colorful or animated with our tank engine. We do like to go for historical accuracy here in the museum collection. And as far as engines to be potentially restored to operation, this one is still sitting relatively low on our to-do list right now. It could potentially be restored as evidenced by Strasbourg's Thomas, but we really don't have a need for this one at the present time. So let's head outside here. That bell ringing is the 12 o'clock group, or no, the 11 o'clock group, clearly after us. pressed gray gravel closest to the stall doors here. All of the tan gravel beyond us here is still settling into the property. There are divots out there where you can turn your ankles. Believe me, I've done it many times. All right, go ahead and fill on out here. All right, so coming out here to the rail yard, there are a couple of major structures that I will point out. The first of which is on the far side of the property from us here right now. That large train shed was only just constructed here on the property within the last month. That is our new car shed that's over 464 feet long, about 64 feet wide, stretches over all 4 of our storage tracks on the far side of the yard from us, and that will allow us to store more of our pieces of equipment under a roof. Before that was constructed, we had all 18 stalls of a roundhouse and 2 stalls, inside of our back shop area. Not really enough to house 23 steam locomotives, about as many diesel electric locomotives, and countless other pieces of rolling stock, passenger cars, freight cars, cabooses, things like that. So with our shop staff constantly working on restoring our pieces in the collection, we need to be able to house more of them under a roof. As far as the roundhouse, we do prioritize the steam locomotives as they are pretty much the stars of our collection, but we also want to keep our other historic pieces under roofs as well. Now, coming a little closer to us, we do have our turntable. It's that large kind of bridge-looking structure. It has a central pivoting point in the middle of it that allows that whole structure to turn a full 360 degrees inside of that circular pit just beyond us here. It's about a 5-foot drop from the edge that we are standing on to the pit's bottom, and I've seen Felix get in and out of there in one jump without any problem. Me, on the other hand, I'm going to have to work a little harder. So please don't go running out to the turntable pit. It's not very fun getting out. Now, looking beyond us here, you can see a number of our other historic pieces, more prominently our diesel locomotives, but I said we have 23 steam engines here in the collection. As far as what you will see today, it's more like 22 and a half. One of our newer acquisitions is still in the process of being transported here, and when it does finally get here and is reassembled, it will be the longest, heaviest, and strongest steam engine in our collection. And Sarah's going to give us a glimpse of half of that engine in the form of its tender. That large black car that she's walking out to right now is the tender of Bessemer and Lake Erie Railroad number 643. The tender itself is about the size of a ranch home, and the locomotive itself is even larger than its tender. When it fully gets here and is reassembled, the locomotive will be 112 feet long and weigh in at a whopping 450 tons. Now our turntable is 115 feet long and can handle locomotives upwards of 400 tons. So we're going to have to be very careful moving 643 around the property here. Our founder did affectionately refer to 643 as the King because it is considered to be the strongest, or one of the largest and strongest non-articulated steam locomotives left in preservation. I specifically say non-articulated because then you get into the realms of Big Boy, Challenger, the Alleghenies from the C&O, and Virginian Railroad. Those were all much stronger than 643, but they're articulated engines with 2 sets of steam engines on a pivoting frame that allows the big engine to negotiate tight curves. If any of you here are familiar with Big Boy, the Big Boy steam locomotives, which you will not see here today, I'm sorry, Big Boys were constructed for the Union Pacific Railroad out in the American West. They are considered to be the largest and strongest steam locomotives ever constructed, but to be more specific, I would refer to them as the largest successful steam locomotives ever constructed. Those were built 132 feet long and weighed in at 1.25 million pounds. There is one of the 8 left in preservation that is in operational condition, number 4014, and it does travel the country quite a bit in operation, but as per the Union Pacific's trackage, it can only go about as far east as West Chicago. And I did get the chance to see that when it came through West Chicago back in 2019. If you are interested in seeing a steam engine of that size in operation, I highly recommend it. When I saw it come through town, it ran through it probably, I would say, about 15 miles an hour. It was going very slow through the crowds, and the ground under my feet was shaking. It is a phenomenal piece of engineering. Now let's move around the turntable pit area. We are already at our hour and a half, so I apologize for taking the tour this long. I keep telling them that they can't let me do this anymore. But anyway, we're going to head around here and go back in through stall number 2. Now, as we're walking around the turntable pit area, you'll start to get a better look at some of our diesel-electric locomotives in our collection, some of whom were original replacements for steam locomotives. So we've got some pretty old diesels out there, as well as some more modern pieces. Have any of you traveled by Amtrak? Yeah? The large diesel locomotives out there with the silver front, number 452 is facing us right now. One of its siblings is coupled up behind it. Those are ex-Amtrak F40PHs, who were the bread and butter of the Amtrak system for decades. Those locomotives were utilized by our founder on his Ohio Central Railroad and are currently up for sale, if any of you would like them. Why not? Now, speaking of diesel locomotives up for sale, the locomotives on the farthest right-hand track across the turntable pit from us, number 1852, painted up black and yellow, and another one just like it, coupled up behind it. I believe it's number 1805 or 1802, painted up red and white. We purchased those specifically because they are rather unique diesel locomotives. They were built by the Fairbanks Morse Company. The Fairbanks Morse Company was the only diesel locomotive manufacturer to experiment with building diesel locomotives, not with diesel engines in them, but submarine engines. So those are two very unique little pieces, and we bought those off of eBay.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
We bought those off eBay. Please don't ask me what the shipping costs for them. I'm sure they were astronomical. All right, so let's head on inside here. All right, come on down to the end of the aisles here. I'll talk about these two engines together. So, sitting on both sides of us right now are examples of the restoration work that our shop staff is able to accomplish. On one side, we have a cosmetic restoration currently in progress, and on the other side, we have a full restoration to operational condition. Coming back to the little one over here on my left, your right, this is Philadelphia and Reading Railroad number 1187. This is actually the newest addition to our collection. It was acquired in August of 2020. So it's only been here for about 2 years at this point. And it is a very rare little bugger because it's not built like a traditional steam locomotive like the others that we have here in our collection. Now, every steam engine has to have a cab, an area where the crew sits to operate the locomotive. On most steam locomotives, that cab is positioned on the back of the engine where the crew can sit together and operate the locomotive in tandem. This locomotive here, the cab was not built on the back of its boiler, but was instead built over the center of its boiler here. So the cab was built over this area of the engine's boiler because this one was built with a very wide firebox, what is called a Wooten-style firebox, specifically built to burn this. This is our pet rock and a genuine hunk of anthracite coal, or clean coal as it was sometimes referred to. Anthracite coal was plentiful in the mountains of eastern Pennsylvania and was very useful for heating homes and office buildings. It doesn't burn as hot as your softer, dirty bituminous coal. It doesn't smell as bad while you burn it. And it also doesn't create dirty black smoke with soot and ash. So that was great for the heating of offices, but during the mining process of anthracite, you developed all these smaller chunks of waste anthracite that was known as culm. Very weird word to say, culm. But anyway, the once president of the Reading Railroad wondered how he could potentially use all of that waste material to fire the steam locomotives on his railroad. And a mechanical engineer, Mr. Wooten, was able to develop the Wooten-style firebox and boiler to burn that waste anthracite. So with anthracite not burning as hot as the softer, dirty bituminous stuff, you need more of it at one time to create the same amount of heat value that you would get from a smaller amount of dirty bituminous coal. So with the firebox being that wide, you would not be able to build a cab on the back end of this little one and still expect it to fit North American Railroad's clearances, like I talked about with the Army engine on the other side of the roundhouse. So the cab for this one was constructed over the center of its boiler. You can see it in the photograph here. It's that right there. The cab was made out of wood, and with this engine sitting outside for quite a few decades, that wooden cab rotted away to almost nothing. We have what is left of the engine's cab here on our property, and it fits in a crate about this big. So this one is being cosmetically restored. Hopefully we'll get to fully reconstruct the cab of this one and reinstall it on the engine to give you a good example of what were known as Camelback steam locomotives. Camelback locomotives were nicknamed as such because their cabs over the center of the boiler gave them a very humpback-looking appearance. There are only 3 Camelbacks left in the country. We have this one here. There's one at the Museum of Transportation in St. Louis, Missouri, and another one at the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad Museum in Baltimore, Maryland. So very rare little pieces, and we're very happy to have this one here. Now, as far as number 12, this is a more traditional steam locomotive and the only one on our property that we can fire up for the public. This one has a good 7 or 8 years left on its boiler time. And unfortunately for it, because of the limitations of our operation at the present time, we're really only able to fire this thing up for special events and occasions here at the museum, one of which will be coming up here on September 9th and 10th, if you come back over here for Steam to Victory, our World War II show. We'll have all kinds of reenactors out on the grounds doing skirmishes and arms demonstrations, and we'll also be doing hour-long tours of the roundhouse and the steam locomotive collection. And 12 here will be fired up, coupled up to a couple of passenger coaches out behind the back shop where you'll be able to jump onto it, and we'll run you up the property and back as far as the turntable, and then in reverse. It's not the longest of train rides, but we only charge $5 a head for it. So you can't really go wrong for $5 and the chance to see a steam locomotive fired up in operation. Now we're going to head back into the back shop area here. The shop staff is not working today since it is a Saturday, but we will stay in between the yellow lines on the floor. We don't want to get ourselves into whatever they've been working on this week. All right, come on in here, and we'll center ourselves right about here. So welcome to the back shop. This is the heart of the Age of Steam Roundhouse, where all of our heavy maintenance and restoration work is done. All around us right now, you can see various examples of the kinds of projects that our shop staff works on a regular basis, every week throughout the year. So the kind of project that everyone likes to see is currently sitting behind me. Locomotive number 19 here is being fully restored to operational condition. We'll be able to pull trains here on the property loaded with people with this engine, and we'll be able to do more with it than the other ones in our collection. It is still currently almost completely stripped down. We've gotten to the point in its restoration where we are starting to put pieces back on it instead of tearing more things off of it. This engine spent a lot of time in excursion service during the 70s, 80s, and even into the 90s. And during that time, a lot of heavier maintenance was deferred on this one. So we've been doing a lot of repairs to this thing that we didn't even anticipate. From testimonies by our shop staff, whom I've spoken with, just about every time they cleaned off a new section of this engine, all they could do was just hang their heads because there was something else that needed to be fixed, more cracks that needed to be filled, another component that needed to be remachined or refabricated. So by the time this one's restoration is done, it will not necessarily be an all-new machine, but a lot of pieces on it will be brand new. Now, this is another movie star in our collection. It has been featured in a couple of different movies, some older films. Are any of you here familiar with the film Emperor of the North? It came out in the 1970s. Sarah, again, you are an employee. You don't count. It stars Lee Marvin and Ernest Borgnine and Keith Carradine. If you're interested in seeing the film, I highly recommend it. From the beginning credits to the very end, you see footage of 19 in action. It's a very good film if you're curious about what lives were like for hobos during the Great Depression. So very good film for that. Not exactly great for kids, I will say, as a disclaimer. But apart from that film, this one was also utilized in the filming of Stand By Me, the Stephen King film. It was not, however, the engine used for the scene where the kids are walking across the bridge and end up having to run away from the train. That wasn't it. I'm trying to remember specifically the scene it was particularly used for, the scene where the kid was standing in the tracks playing chicken with the train. That was 19. So after being very badly beaten and worn in excursion service, our founder acquired it and actually spent $400,000 to acquire this one at a sheriff's auction. And we've dumped a lot of money into it for the restoration of it at this point. By the time this thing is done, it will be a multi-million-dollar restoration. Now, with it being completely torn apart right now, this does allow me to answer one of our commonly asked questions, particularly with kids here on the tours. When the engines are fully put together, a lot of times we get kids that are curious and point out individual components on the engine and ask, well, the engine itself is so big, how much does this little piece on it weigh? How much does this piece weigh? How much does that piece? And with the engine fully put together, we can't really answer that question. I can tell you that when 19 is fully put together, it weighs about 90 tons, but with it being torn apart, looking at the driving wheels here, these have been removed out from underneath the engine, sent through our wheel lathe, that large gray machine back there, to true up the exterior of the locomotive's tires to bring them back to as near perfect a circle as is mechanically obtainable. And in that point, they've been stripped of all paint and relabeled so that not only do our shop staff know where to put them back at underneath the engine, but also shows us how much each of these pairs of wheels weigh. Starting from the front at the lightest, we're looking at 5,550 pounds, and looking at the heaviest wheel pair here, where all of the rods attached to the locomotive's driving wheels, we're looking at 7,220 pounds for this pair of wheels. Are any of you into powerlifting by any chance? At any rate, that's why we have the phrase safety first painted on the overhead crane as well as on the banner on the back wall there. Working in this kind of environment is not inherently dangerous, but it is very unforgiving. If you're scurrying around in this kind of environment, you may end up losing, at best, a digit, or at worst, your life. So our shop staff has worked very carefully here in this environment. We've had no major casualties here at the museum. Up to this point, knock on wood, I don't see any wood around me, so someone do that later on. But anyway, our shop staff is very well trained. Thank you, Sarah. Now, behind us here is another one of our steam locomotives. This one is not being restored to full operational condition, but it is going through a cosmetic restoration to a point. This is Wheeling and Lake Erie Railroad number 3960, the most local engine in our collection. It was built by the Wheeling and Lake Erie Railroad's Brewster shops in Brewster, Ohio, not but 16 miles away from us here in Sugar Creek. And it regularly operated down in Zanesville, Ohio as their yard switcher. And whenever it would go between Zanesville and Brewster, at least once a month to get its boiler washed out, it would run up the line just outside of our property. That was at one time part of the Wheeling and Lake Erie Railroad system. Last time it did that was October 31st, 1957. So with this one being such a notable local engine for our collection, we wanted to look a little nicer at least. So what we're going to do with it right now is cosmetically restore it as far as everything except the boiler. The boiler we have gridded up to look very similar to the ultrasounding process. Number 19's boiler was once gridded up very similar to this when we were having its boiler ultrasounded. So we are going to use this one as a teaching tool. So we're going to fix up just about everything else around it to make it look a bit more like this photograph here. This is its builder photograph when it was first built in Brewster in 1935. All shiny and new and ready to head down to Zanesville for work. It won't look exactly like this when the cosmetic restoration is done, but it'll look a heck of a lot nicer than it does presently. Another example of an engine that spent a lot of time sitting outside in a park display. Now another job that our shop staff has to undertake regularly is the regular maintenance of our functional diesel engines in the collection. Montour number 84 and its twin, number 82, which is sitting just outside of the back shop area here, are our functional diesel electric switches that we commonly use to move larger pieces of equipment or trains of equipment around the museum yard. 84 is going through some mechanical maintenance, and its sibling, number 82, is in perfect working order. So these are just good examples of how, even though we do have a year-round shop staff working tirelessly to restore the pieces that we have, their time is divided in multiple different projects. And even if you look outside the back shop area here, you can see a number of our old stock that are currently correct for our World War II show. The red box car that's hanging up on the Pennsylvania Railroad, all of that paintwork was done around the last couple of months. So, and boxcar, the green boxcar on the other side of the black car, that was done this week. Our shop staff is currently divided between multiple different projects. And you'll see pieces of parts from the 19th itself scattered not only throughout the back shop area here, but if you notice some of the red or freshly black painted spare pieces that we saw down in the 19th, some of our overall from the 19th. This is our drop table that spans over all three tracks here in the back shop. In the area where the tracks
Thanks.
You know where you speak. Well, I mean, I didn't know it from back older, but you weren't an engineer, know what you're saying. You understood it. Yeah.
so about 40 minutes away. Started with Brio and Thomas, just never grew out of it. All right, now I like that our passenger car is here getting repainted. It does provide a very colorful curtain to help me unveil the big engine here. So we're going to center ourselves between these two to end things off here today. Before Bessemer and Lake Erie 643 gets here and is fully reassembled, 763 and 6325 behind me are the largest steam locomotives that you will see here in the House of Residence. Starting with number 763, this is the longest, heaviest, and strongest locomotive currently sitting here inside of the building, and the only locomotive in our collection that was built by the Lima Locomotive Works out of Lima, Ohio. During the Age of Steam, there were three major locomotive manufacturers here in the United States. You had Baldwin out of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, American Locomotive Company, also known as Alco, out of Schenectady, New York, and here in Ohio, the smaller of the three, kind of late to the party, was the Lima Locomotive Works out of Lima, Ohio. Now, Baldwin and Alco have certainly made a lot of impressive and successful steam locomotives to their credit, but as many rail fans will sometimes tell you, Lima here in Ohio built the Cadillacs of steam locomotives. Many impressive, efficient, fast, powerful, whatever superlative you want to attest to a steam locomotive, very good machines came out of the Lima shops, including at 763. This locomotive was built in 1944 for the New York, Chicago, and St. Louis Railroad, better known as the Nickel Plate Road. What the nickel plate specialized in was carrying farm goods from the American West across the Midwest east to Buffalo, New York, where they would surrender those goods to other railroads to take to the urban markets on the eastern side of the country. Now, this was back before modern refrigeration technologies were at work on America's railroads. So the fruits, vegetables, and raw meat that these locomotives carried behind them did have a real chance to spoil if they didn't make it to their destinations on time. So these locomotives being built for heavy freight trains had to be strong, and in order to maintain those very strict deadlines, they had to be fast as well. This is a good example of a steam engine built to not only be strong, but fast. 763 has a top speed of about 70 miles an hour or more, and they commonly got speeding tickets because of that high speed capability. The Nickel Plate Road was quoted as being the railroad to get the most speeding tickets from the Interstate Commerce Commission running their hotshot freights across the American Midwest. And these locomotives made a name for themselves doing that sort of work. These locomotives specifically laughed early diesel demonstrators off of Nickel Plate's property twice before the realities of dwindling parts and more expensive fuel and crew costs ultimately did the steam locomotives in on the Nickel Plate. They loved their steam engines. And this type in particular, with a 2-8-4 wheel arrangement, this type was commonly referred to as a Berkshire or Berkshire type steam locomotive, and depending on who you talk to, you're saying it wrong. So the locomotives got that nickname because their type was first tested on the Boston and Albany Railroad through the Berkshire Mountain Range. So that's where the name came from. If you're really going by geographical features, it should be pronounced Berkshire. Some people pronounce it Berkshire and are very adamant about pronouncing it that way. I don't care either way. So we'll just call it a Berk to avoid any issues. Now, this is one of about half a dozen of these nickel plate Berks that have made it into preservation. Ours is not in operational condition by any stretch of the imagination. However, one of its siblings is, yes, Nickel Plate Road number 765 operates out of Fort Wayne, Indiana. Throughout the year, and the locomotive does sometimes come here to the state of Ohio, typically at least once a year over to the Cuyahoga Valley Scenic Railroad, the one that runs between Independence and Akron, Ohio. I was able to catch 765 when it came here in May. It usually comes over in September. It may be yet coming back to the valley in September, or it may not. I've not really seen any evidence one way or the other, but it was fantastic to see this engine when it came through here in May. And it looks just like this one. So if you want to see an engine just like this one in operation, Het Up 765. Or, if you want to see an engine of this same type, but just slightly different, go up to Michigan. Are any of you here familiar with the Polar Express? There we go. Read the book, or at least seen the movie, The Polar Express. Chris Van Allsburg, the author and illustrator of The Polar Express, was inspired to make that book from a locomotive of this same type from the Père Marquette Railroad. The locomotive, numbered 1225, was at one point displayed at Michigan State University outside of their engineering building. And Mr. Van Allsburg saw that locomotive on display as a child and a young adult, and was inspired to make a book about children being taken to the North Pole at Christmas time on a big black steam engine just like Père Marquette 1225. And that number helped inspire the story. Take the number of the locomotive, 1225, and turn it into a date. What do you get?
Christmas.
Christmas. Perfect. Now, I used to think that it was the number that helped the locomotive get saved for preservation, but unfortunately, its preservation story wasn't that romantic. Quite frankly, Michigan State University was looking for a steam locomotive to put on display, and 1225 just happened to be the last one in the scrap line, the easiest one to pull out. So that is how it ended up in preservation, and has since been fully restored to operational condition. If you go up to the Steam Railroading Institute in Owasso, Michigan, they have Père Marquette 1225, and they pull that engine out for their special Christmas trains that they run in November and December. When Warner Brothers Entertainment decided to make the Polar Express movie, they modeled the engine itself off of Père Marquette 1225 to honor its heritage as the engine that inspired the original story. The locomotive was used to model the engine in the film. Some sound bites from the engine were used during the filming process. But a rather unfortunate byproduct of the movie's creation is that now Warner Brothers Entertainment owns the Polar Express. Before the movie came out, if any small excursion operation wanted to run a Christmas train and call it the Polar Express, sure, fine, whatever. Now, if you want to run a Polar Express train, you have to do a fully licensed Polar Express program that Warner Brothers sells to you. You use their script, their merchandise, this, that, and the other, and a lot of smaller operations like the Steam Railroading Institute are not able to facilitate all of that. So even though they have the true-to-life Polar Express engine, they're not able to call their Christmas train the Polar Express. Not trying to disparage the movie or the book or any parties involved. It's just a rather unfortunate byproduct of the whole situation. Now, moving over here, number 6325. We're back to where we started here in the Roundhouse. This locomotive is not the longest or the heaviest locomotive in our collection. It's about 95 feet long, whereas 763 is 101, and 643 will be 112. It's not the heaviest weighing in at about 325 tons, as opposed to 763's 350 when empty. But this is the locomotive with the tallest diameter driving wheels in our collection. It's 73 inches tall. Now take that rough little figure that I told you about towards the beginning of the tour with the 10% tacked on. So 73 plus 10%, this locomotive top speed is roughly 80 plus miles per hour. Now, that makes it the fastest locomotive in our collection already. But this was the largest steam engine that our founder had restored on his Ohio Central Railroad. And when it was first unveiled in the fall of 2001, for some of its first runs, we got some guests who were locomotive operators on the Grand Trunk Western Railroad, the railroad this one was originally built for, to sit at the throttle of this locomotive and basically relive some of their golden years. And from their testimonies, they said that they did not feel comfortable running this class of locomotive much faster than 90 miles an hour. So it can at least hit 90. There was a testimony from one of our museum board members who had evidence that stated that a locomotive of this type and class, not this one in particular, but one of its siblings, was able to reach 106.5 miles per hour. And then on top of that, we have another story that one of our other tour guides supposedly heard from the neighbor of one of the engineers of this engine in particular, who said that he was able to get number 6325 up to 114 miles per hour. And in doing so was not able to stop the engine in time when he was coming into the station. Ran through the platform at the end of the track and was given a 30-day vacation for that. Sadly, we have not been able to come up with any physical evidence of either of those claims, so we're basically left to guess just how fast this engine could go. So the short answer to how fast this thing can go is fast. Definitely a lot faster than any of the other engines in our collection. Now, it is still in good mechanical condition. Its boiler does need to be ultrasounded, and there are some minor mechanical issues that need to be addressed with this one to get it back into full operational condition. But the real reason why we haven't done any of that yet is that we don't have a need to do so. We don't have an excursion operation running here at the museum at the present time, and even if we did start running regular trains here on the museum property, that would be way too small of an operation for something this big. So if we decide to fully restore this one, it won't be until we can run equipment out on the main line for the public again, which will hopefully be in the not too distant future. But anyway, so before we end things off today, I'll come back to those questions I asked you before. How many of you had been here before? Everyone raise your hand. You've been here now. There we go. Now, for those of you that didn't come here already with an interest in trains, how many of you heard something here that caught your interest? Okay, there we go. Our main goal here is not to leave you heading out of the museum going, oh my gosh, I love trains. I love them so much. No, that would be astounding to accomplish in an hour and a half. 2 hours. Anyway, but what we're trying to do is just spark some interest into this subject. That way, more of you may be interested in helping us preserve these, or maybe go out to another organization to help them preserve the history and the machinery involved with our American railroads. So your support is definitely appreciated here at the museum. Please go to other railroad museums. They all need our help as well. So thank you for coming out here today. That pretty much concludes our tour today. And from here, we'll head back over to the Visitor Center where I will be available to answer any questions that you might have.